increase inflationary pressures depending on how employment and hours worked are affected. A minimum wage increase would benefit the direct income of only the 36% of WA employees in the state system, not the unemployed or other workers not covered by the state system. Not only is there insufficient evidence to conclude that there would be an increase in aggregate demand and consumption, as those who are affected represent a small portion of WA's working age population, an increase in the minimum wage would increase inflationary pressures for the other 64% of employees, as their wages aren't affected by the change in the minimum wage. Unless there are questions from the bench, I conclude my submissions at this point.
Thank you, Mr. Farrell.
Thank you.
Dr. Diamond.
Thank you, Chief Commissioner. So, may it please the Commission in Court session, I will outline the Unions WA position on increasing award and minimum wages. Now, Unions WA is relying on its written initial submissions and submissions in reply to make its main points that our claim to increase award wages and the statutory minimum wage by $43.61 per week, or by 6%, whichever is greater. However, as part of the oral submission, we would seek to make some further points. Unions WA contends that the Commission should make a substantial increase, real wage increase for award-reliant workers, and that is reflected in our claim. An underlying, of course, reason for this is that Unions WA is asking the WA Commission, within its statutory powers, to address the ever-widening gap between low-wage workers and the rest of the workforce in WA. As is outlined in our initial submissions and is also referenced in the WACOS submissions, recent minimum wage decisions both at WA at the national and the national levels have seen a decline of the minimum wage bite, as in the proportion of the minimum wage compared to median weekly earnings. A more recent flattening of that decline is more to do with lower wage growth generally, rather than improved wage growth at the bottom. I'd add as an aside that we have more recently, whereas previously we've looked at using average wages, average weekly ordinary time earnings. We're fortunate in that we have more data on median wages at the state level, so that allows us to do some point-to-point comparisons between the state and the national wage. Now, just making reference to the national wage hearings, the ACTU has supported the adoption of a medium-term target for the minimum wage, that to be 60% of the median wage for full-time employees. Unions WA supports this and supports a similar target being considered for the WA industrial relations system. We believe that reaching such a target will help deliver a living wage in respect to the Australian tradition set by the Harvester decision, meeting the normal needs of an average employee regarded as a human being living in a civilised community, is the famous term. Now, the OECD has defined the level of relative poverty to be at about 60% of full-time median earnings, and thus it seemed appropriate at the state and the national level to adopt that as a benchmark. We note that the target of 60% of the median has been explicitly adopted in the United Kingdom, where the Low Pay Commission, the LPC, the independent body that advises the government about the national living wage and the national minimum wage. The 60% target has been adopted, and they've also found that since the UK national minimum wage was introduced in 1999, it has managed to rise faster than average earnings and inflation without damaging jobs. In its submission, WACOS has pointed out that income inequality has a significant negative impact on society, both socially and economically, being linked not only to the undermining of community cohesiveness, but also having a statistically significant adverse effect on economic growth. Thus, we would say that a 60% of median wage is not in any way a radical or outlandish claim. This is a proportion that the Australian wages system has had well within living memory. Workers were not striving less or working less hard during this time. What we had was a system of distribution of wages ensuring that work paid.
Dr. Diamond, this median, the proportion of a median wage, and I think it's referred to as a relative poverty line or poverty marker. What concerns me about it, I suppose, is that if it is measured, the 60% is measured by reference to a median wage, WA's median wage is higher than the rest of Australia. WA's minimum wage is higher than the rest of Australia. WA's median wage, as I recall, has declined since the peak of the resource and construction boom. So it would seem to me that if you're using a relative figure such as that, which is more volatile, you're likely to end up with less predictability and more volatility. But you also have a relative position that's dependent on something that doesn't necessarily relate, and perhaps you can comment on this for me, it doesn't relate to living standards, but relates to what someone else gets. And I'm not sure how that is a good measure of, there may be something within the materials that indicates why that's appropriate rather than an absolute measure.
Certainly, Commissioner. I mean, to the extent that there's a consideration in the Act for providing fair wage standards in the context of living standards generally, we would certainly feel that the median wage in WA is still something that makes reference to living standards generally within this state, and is thus nevertheless an appropriate figure by which to make reference to when we're setting the minimum wage. I'd also make the point actually that the 6% that we've gone for in this particular claim would only constitute a sort of a fraction of the way, if you like, towards that 60% compared to what it would be at the national level. So we've adopted a sort of a fairly modest goal.
You've got a staged approach.
It would be a staged approach, and on the face of it, would be a longer staged approach than it would be for the national figures. That's certainly the case. Right. And I mean, in terms of the reference point for a more potentially volatile figure, we would say that Western Australia, it's been a long-standing feature of the West Australian economy. It seems that we do have boom and bust cycles.
Indeed.
And so to the extent that wages systems need to accommodate that, that is often a statement that we hear. Various aspects of the WA economy need to accommodate that. And that should include, frankly, where we set the minimum wage. But whereas we would say whereas some would argue that that's why we should keep the minimum wage as low as possible, we would argue on the contrary that the need to certainly maintain a level of consumer spending, a need to maintain a level of public demand, a need to maintain a level of public consumption, which David Christmas in his presentation definitely showed us at a very low level. If we're going to have a state minimum wage, then it should be paying attention to distinctly West Australian conditions. So in that sense, we feel that a link or a benchmark or a target that goes to the state median is appropriate, precisely because these are all wage earners within the West Australian community.
Thank you, that's very helpful.
Why would we need to look at it from year to year if we have a target of getting to 60%? And you say, let's achieve that over 3 years or 4 years, whatever you want to say, and you want to say business must be able to afford to pay everyone at least 60% of the median. What are we doing from year to year?
What's the role of the Industrial Relations Commission?
And all the things that 50 capital A lists, if it's just reaching a target over a certain period of time against the background that it's assumed business can afford it.
Well, we certainly accept the point that the Commission has to pay attention to a number of different aspects every year. Our contention, of course, is that a sort of modest effort to move towards that 60% does nevertheless address some of those other criteria about sort of the state of the WA economy and the state of the national economy. We are arguing that having greater wage equality, if you put it like that, or less inequality, is actually a positive boon for those aspects of that performance of the WA economy, precisely for the reasons, and I think WACOS goes into some more detail than this, but I'll just basically say that income inequality having a negative impact on society. So we would contend that if the Commission is looking at, or when the Commission looks at, for the sake of argument, the state of the WA economy, the state of the WA economy must include that issue of is the distribution of income becoming too widely dispersed, too unequal, or is it becoming less unequal? Because that precisely goes to the point that if we're creating a system where there's a larger number of people kept in the lower paid regions of the income distribution, that is a negative result for the WA economy, and it is also a drag for overall economic performance and economic growth. So we are making an argument.
I'll be honest with you, Dr. Dunn, I just get year in, year out, I get distracted. I look at the Unions WA stuff and I find myself getting distracted when you start joining in with the ACTU and stuff when they're not here to talk about it and you attempt to explain what they mean. I'm just distracted now by this idea of a target that we should be working towards, which to me seems completely nonsensical if we have to look at it every year. Mm-hmm. Don't you just tell us at the moment why it should be X amount rather than telling us in 2 or 3 years we'd like to be at Y?
Well, I guess, Commissioner, I can only put our line of reasoning to you. Our argument is that you need a substantial minimum wage increase. You need a substantial minimum wage increase that's certainly greater than inflation and considerably greater than inflation and the cost of living. It is a greater minimum wage increase because of the reasons that are also set out in our submission, that we need to restore household consumption growth. We need household spending. And we should also have a minimum wage increase because it is a desirable goal of economic policy in its own right that we move towards a more equal society. It is a desirable economic policy in its own right that some sort of benchmark is maintained whereby we can measure our progress towards that. We are making the proposal that 60% is as decent an international standard as you are likely to find. Some people have suggested that it's not adequate enough, but it's as decent an international standard as you are likely to find, and it is incumbent upon Unions WA to make the recommendation about a roadmap to that goal as part of our increase, even though we are obviously not asking for it as our immediate increase this year. We are being sensitive to the needs of business and the needs of the economy and the needs of predictability. And indeed, by sort of projecting 2, 3, arguably 4 years ahead, we are proposing that business each year, if the Commission so pleases to award something in the realms of what we're asking for, that business can have a reasonable expectation that this is the direction that wages in Western Australia are likely to go.
Okay, thanks, Dr. Don.
Are you effectively telling us that that benchmark, 60% of median wage, is the fair wage standard in the context of living standards generally within the community as one of the factors under Section 50A?
Yeah, we are proposing that it's certainly consistent with that.
Thank you.
I think that's our position. Others may disagree with that position, but that is the position that we're putting forward.
Thank you, Dr.
What we
Dunn.
think is a reasonable international standard for that. So yes, so moving on, in fact, from that, Unions WA, apologies if I'm reiterating this point, is maintaining that the needs of the low paid require an increase, as I was just saying, of the minimum wage, not just at CPI, not just as living standards narrowly conceived, but beyond that. And the interests of the unemployed moving into work or moving into paid work are not served by making a worker simply as cheap as possible on the labour market. Our contention is that job quality is inseparable from having decent pay and conditions that actively improve living standards, not just by paying workers just enough to cover immediate costs, living costs. And with that in mind, I'd refer you to some of the work that we cite in our submission from the Centre for Future Work, basically arguing the case that wages flowing through to consumption is a better way of meeting the needs of the low paid than interest rates and tax changes. Specifically, wage increases, of course, can and should occur every year, having a compounding effect on incomes. Wage increases will deliver a benefit to employed persons, even if their income was so low that they didn't have to pay income tax, whereas, of course, tax changes, of course, primarily benefit you if you're already paying tax in the first place. The savings from tax cuts is more concentrated amongst higher income households, since they're the ones who are currently paying at higher rates. And generally speaking, we would say that high minimum wages are a complement to the Australian tax transfer system rather than an alternative to it. In Australia, workers can escape poverty by working full-time. And you compare that to the wages system in many other countries, where they basically maintain a working poor. People can still be in poverty and in wages, earning wages. And we would argue that having a high minimum wage is a feature of the Australian system that actually complements rather than is an alternative to our tax transfer system. With that in mind, Unions WA, of course, contends that an increase in the state minimum wage in WA is more likely to assist workers in vulnerable groups who are less likely to negotiate decent pay increases for themselves. And as was pointed out in our initial submission, employers are simply not going to lift wages through the low paid, we would argue, through the actions of market forces. We do this by demonstrating some work from the Reserve Bank of Australia, where they basically provided a list of all the alternatives that employers are using instead of wage increases in order to compete and attract and retain staff. Now, they, of course, are fully entitled to do that under the current system, but that just demonstrates, in our view, the importance of having an institutional institutional increase in wages. Now, there's been some terms used like artificial. There's been some terms like sort of top-down rather than bottom-up. I guess we're arguing that the term institutional increases are the most appropriate because it requires, in this sort of labour market, specific policy decisions, such as something that employers are by themselves not willing to do and won't do, as the Reserve Bank of Australia has observed on a number of occasions. This is what we mean when, or what economists mean when the term monopsony is used. Now, monopsony is certainly a very abstract theoretical term, but taking it literally as simply mean it must mean a labour market where there's only one employer. That's not what monopsony is meant to mean. It's meant to be a way of describing a model of how employers operate, a particular way and particularly the advantage that employers are in, or the advantage that employers are in the labour market. And it's common to use these sorts of abstractions. Most of the classical models of the economy that are used by used by employer groups, for example, commonly assume all resources are fully employed and that there's a single price of labour. That's the basis for a lot of the classical models of the economy. So this is another model, if you like, and basically is meant to indicate that there are situations in which employers, certainly they can argue they are competing with one another, competing with one another, but, and they're competing with one another to the extent that they don't want to increase pay because they'll increase their labour costs, is precisely the institutional step of raising wages generally, and that is precisely what's needed essentially because it preserves, if you like, no one is being forced into a less competitive system by virtue of having pay increased. Now, there is debate about exactly how influential a minimum wage increase is on wages generally. We have previously argued, and we've had some words in this chamber about the signalling impact of minimum wage increases. But we do think minimum wages are important not simply for the benefits that the wage increase provides themselves to particular workers, but also for that signalling effect, if you like, that goes out to the wage increase generally. Nevertheless, we do, of course, favour a wage increase because it will contribute to the improved living standards for employees. We submit that given increases to living costs that impact disproportionately on low-wage workers, changes to taxes and charges are no substitute for regular ongoing pay increases. And in our submission in reply, we do... Oops. In the wrong submission, excuse me a moment. So if you look on our pages 3 and 4, we reproduce a chart from the Centre for Future Work, and also an attempt of our own chart to demonstrate the strong seasonal pattern in the wage price index arising from the concentration of wage increases around the 1st of July. The original WPI series shows a sharp jump in the September quarter, and that's changes in the national minimum wage. And then we would argue that you can also see some effect from this going into the state minimum wage as well. So we would argue, therefore, that given that, as the Minister's submission has identified, and we of course agree with, that there are a large number of occupations, I should say, that are identified as award-free employees in the state system. It is particularly important that these institutional pay increases to minimum wages and award rates go through, because it's fairly clear that a lot of these employees will simply be unable to reach an industrial agreement under their own terms. Similarly, we would argue that a substantial wage increase that will play its part in making apprenticeships and traineeships more attractive by encouraging greater skills development. Once again, we'd rely a lot on our submissions for saying this, but we would simply make the point that at the moment, given that training rates in Western Australia have been, it's fair to say, bumping along the bottom at the very least in terms of numbers of people that are in there, the opportunity...
There's also a gradual increase, I think, over the years in adult apprentices, which would mean the minimum wage is particularly significant in that aspect.
Absolutely right, Commissioner, I would say. We shouldn't assume that younger people, it's simply a young people's game to be a apprentice or a trainee. And so that aspect of providing a living wage while you're taking the time to improve your skills and your skills development is going to be particularly important, or is particularly important. On the question of equal remuneration for men and women for work of equal or comparable value, Unions WA has of course asked the Commission to bear in mind, as we have on previous submissions, that there's an issue of inequality within households as well as inequality between households. We've made reference in the past to various points of income inequality between males and females who happen to be living in the same house. So it's not a question of sort of, in the words of a particular federal government report, there's sort of a husband is a retirement plan. It's very important that people have their own, if you like, financial resources within households, even if they're living in a relatively sort of, even if they appear to be living in relatively favourable sort of household financial circumstances as well. So some people have argued that when we refer to the Harvester judgment, that we're referring to a very old-fashioned standard of the male wage earner who has to support a family. Well, if that's the case, then we ought to bear in mind that individuals need a sort of, living wage regardless of their particular family circumstances in any given time. But moving on to some of the broader implications on the national and the state economy. Unions WA is of course contending that a substantial increase in WA minimum wage will be stimulatory in present economic circumstances in WA and Australia, and that it will assist the growth in household income by increasing aggregate demand. Now, Mr. Christmas talked about some of the downward revisions in the global growth forecast, and that makes it more important that domestic consumption, we would argue, needs to hold up. And the question, once again, of where that increase is going to come from is particularly important for these hearings. We would argue that it's the institutional pressures or the institutional decisions that come from minimum and award wages that are going to be particularly important. Nevertheless, there is the point that was made about internet vacancies are still lifting. There are still new job ads. Those are, it's true, in mining, but we would nevertheless, insofar as we do rely on mining a great deal, it is significant for a sort of at least grounds for optimism. And there would be further grounds for optimism if, as we say, that some of the retail trade and some of the demand for retail trade and the demand for hospitality was given more of a boost by an increase in the discretionary spending aspect, which, as Mr. Christmas's presentation showed, is going very, very low indeed. Now, as was discussed earlier, there's no completely accurate measure of state-level profitability, and similarly, there's very few accurate measures for state-level productivity as well. The comment has been made that wage increases should be linked to productivity. I have to say, Commissioners, that a number of years ago, we did actually bring some productivity measures for the state level, and indeed attempts to make productivity measures for state level retail trade to this tribunal, and presented with them that the Chamber of Commerce was very sceptical. They did not regard them as very reliable at all. And indeed, a lot of their scepticism was no doubt very, very justified given the difficulty in measuring this. So what we do know is that productivity at the national level, wages has simply not kept up with productivity at all. And insofar as we're making a general sort of reference to that, wages and productivity have been decoupled for a very, very long time, and it's to the detriment of wages rather than to the benefit of productivity, I would have to say. Moving on to...
Before you do,
Yep.
it has occurred to me that not only are we required to take account of those issues that are identified in section 50A 2, or 3 rather, there's also section 26 1D considerations. And one of those is any changes in productivity that have occurred or are likely to occur, and there are a number of other issues there too. I've noted that none of the submissions address the section 26 matters, but certainly you are attempting to address the productivity issue, I think you're quite correct that we found it difficult in the past to get accurate information about productivity changes in this state. But you would, I take it, then say, well, we can only make assumptions based on the federal material that's available. The other thing that occurs to me is that some years ago, excuse me, we did have a statement of principles that required consideration of productivity change, and there were cases that went for weeks to demonstrate whether increases in rates of pay were justified in particular organisations on the basis of productivity, and all sorts of KPIs were considered at various industry and enterprise levels, but we have not for some time now had any real data on productivity before us, and obviously it's a lack of available specific productivity data.
Well, I think you're right, obviously, Commissioner, that we operate somewhat in the dark when it comes to productivity, particularly the way it might impact on some of these businesses that are most likely to be affected by the minimum wage increase. I guess, though, I think we can make a general point that whatever the impact of productivity, whatever the impact of the minimum wage, it's fair to say that wages in Australia generally don't appear to be keeping up with them. And I think we are at least in a position to, or at least Unions WA would contend that we're at least in a position to make that claim. And so with that in mind, I think it would be, I think when we're looking at the impact of the minimum wage on the state of the WA economy and the state of the national economy, looking at some issues such as sort of the ability to restore household spending, the ability to restore consumption, are some of the issues that we might conceivably be able to make more of a judgment about. That's the best I can respond on that point in the absence of information. So with that in mind, Unions WA is contending that employers cannot credibly argue at the moment that they're currently operating in a high labour cost environment. There's no reason in this environment in that case, for the WA Commission to restrain growth on the minimum wage in order to maintain sort of low labour costs, because labour costs are low.
I don't think they say that they are not operating in a low market cost environment. I think what Mr Farrell says is we're just not making enough profits to pay more. That's as I understood it. Now, the strength of the evidence that he presented in support of that is another matter, but I think, in fairness to him, that is what he says. Profits are down.
The profits
Not that labour is expensive, but just that profits are down.
Profits are down, but in terms of their ability to compete and make more and make however many profits or however much in profits that they're prepared to go for, we don't think that that labour costs are necessarily going to be the decisive factor in determining whether or not they can keep operating or keep employing people. And that goes to some of the points, and perhaps I'll jump to this, some of the general points that have been made about the economic evidence of the increase of a minimum wage, evidence of an increase, the impact, of an increase to the minimum wage on employment levels. Look, I can appreciate from the Commission's point of view, we appear to get into dueling lists of studies about some people say X and some people say Y. I would say, though, that the balance of economic studies have demonstrated over the years that the catastrophic predictions of job loss from minimum wage increases simply have not eventuated.
Are we looking at the material at pages 13 through 16
I
of the original?
beg your pardon? You are.
So that section 4, as I read it, does challenge the orthodoxy. Is that fair? The Chief Commissioner said that, look, this body now accepts, and has accepted for some time, that moderate rises to the minimum wage will not have a deleterious impact on employment or the economy generally.
Mm-hmm.
So let's describe that as the orthodox position. You challenge that, and you say, look, let's go a bit further. Let's go big, because medium hasn't had any impact, so we can now feel comfortable going big. Is that a fair summary?
Well, I think going back to our previous discussion, Commissioner, I was obviously stressing that I don't think that our 6% claim necessarily is going that big when you look at it in relation to the benchmark that we're obviously attempting to do. But I do think that
By comparison to recent
decisions, it's certainly the case that we're proposing to be more ambitious. It's fair to say. We are proposing to be more ambitious because we think, or we feel, that a substantial boost to that household spending is necessary for the economy. People spending money, people demanding things, people going to the shops has been recognised up and down as a reason why, up and down the country, as a reason why sort of the Australian economy has been travelling at a, not going into recession, it's true, but travelling at a sort of performing modestly.
in the
perhaps
second
I'll say.
year, I suppose.
Yes, yeah.
But you also challenge the orthodoxy of wage rises. You say wage rises are not about ability to pay and about effectively supply and demand. You say, as I understand what's set out at 4.4, that normally to get a wage rise, job A is being done at wage X. Job B becomes available, and you expect the holder of job A to rush off and take job B if it's paying more money. But that's not happening because of the factors at 4.4, you say.
Well, the fact is that that level of job competition, lifting pay increases, is not necessarily taking place in this current environment.
Yes, and other factors such as personal preference, knowledge of the other job, the cost of changing jobs, and so on, are having an impact. So what you say is it's not that wages aren't going up. It's not about the ability of business to pay.
Yeah.
It's about these other factors. That's what you say.
There are other factors. It can't simply be reduced to a business's ability to pay.
Now, without rejecting your challenges to orthodoxy out of hand, could you realistically expect this body to overturn orthodoxies on the basis of a few paragraphs in a submission? Would we not need to hear evidence?
All right,
Realistic.
as in expert evidence.
Economists.
Well, look, once again, this is obviously.
Because all these papers are recent. They're all 2018, aren't they?
No, not necessarily. There are some that are recent. There's one that's there's accounts of Professor Dubé, who's going back to 2013. There is, of course, even the Andrew
I've got
Lee.
Footnote 21, 2018. Footnote 22, 2018. Footnote 24, 2018. Footnote 25, May 2019. I'm saying a lot of the things that you're putting before us as a challenge to the orthodoxy is relatively recent.
Well, if it pleases the Commission, I can actually refer people to a submission on the minimum wage case that I made about 4 years ago that went back to 1947 that actually proposed something roughly similar, though using not quite the same terms as what's called the new minimum wage research. That went right back to
That's the washer and
It rings a bell, Mr. John.
Newmark and
Newmark-
Washer.
and
Newmark and Washer is actually relatively recent in that case too. They I believe, were about 2007
yes.
was when they did their response. The Card and Kruger research was 1992. But the debate between George Stigler, famous classical economist who set out the seminal article arguing the neoclassical view of the issue with minimum wages, minimum wages, you raise the wage, all other things being equal, you push people out of the labour market, and so raising minimum wages sort of causes more unemployment. That was published in 1947. In the very next edition of the American Journal of Economics, it was published by the American Economics Association, was an article by Richard Lester, who argued that essentially, if you look at the actual results of what was then the US Fair Labor Standards Act and its impact on its impact on local labour markets, particularly in the manufacturing sector of the southern United States, you'll see that really the dire consequences predicted by Stigler's model simply did not happen. And if you were trying to sort of summarise it, you would say that the reason those things haven't happened is because the economy is always moving at some level, and something is always happening. And it can't simply be assumed, the classic assumption in modelling is ceteris paribus, all things being equal. That's useful for when you're putting forward a theoretical proposition, but simply in the real world, it doesn't happen. And the real world is not like that. And not even labour markets back in the day before the Fair Labor Standards Act acted in that way, in conforming to the classical model. So in a sense, they've never really acted like that. They've never really behaved like that. If it had, then everyone would have lost their job a long time ago because wages have gone up since then. And really, the institutional factors of raising the minimum wage by decision, by fiat, by laws, by institutional measures and all those sorts of things, they are as natural a part of labour markets as anything to do with pure market forces. And we're not trying to argue that sort of businesses' abilities to pay has no impact whatsoever, but the simple truth is that businesses are not making decisions to increase wages simply based on now I do have the ability to pay. They make decisions on essentially trying to keep their labour costs low in the course of general competitiveness. And we would argue that if you make broad institutional wage increases by fiat or from the top, if you like, you're basically making a common lift that means that employers, businesses that are competing against one another within local labour markets are not necessarily sort of disadvantaged from one another in terms of competition on labour costs. And I guess once again, referring back to our submission, our initial submission, we made the point from the economist Saul Eslake, who made the point that smaller businesses generally have 44% lower labour costs than medium-sized competitors. And, the competitive environment of businesses is to be the sort of situation where if a general increase in award wages goes to everybody, it's not going to be a wage cost with one another. And so, and if you look once again at places where the WA economy needs spending in retail, spending in hospitality, that is where we need a situation where a pay increase that goes to people who are low paid, and even after this increase will not be moving into the highest paid ranks by any means, but then nevertheless there are people who will go out, have a higher propensity to consume, a higher propensity to save. This will be of benefit to local labour markets, to local product markets, and as a means of re-injecting and at the very least maintaining and ideally improving the sort of levels of household consumption. So with that that's basically, if you like, my move from the theoretical to the practical on that particular point. Like I say, I try not to speak too much, if you like, for general points in small business, because none of us seem to be in a position to really do that. I would say, just by way of concluding a couple of factors, we are of course asking for $43.61 per week or 6%, whichever is greater, because we are concerned to maintain some of those skills-based relativities in award classifications. We do make the point in our initial submission of doing some comparisons between when the Commission's done a flat increase and when it's done a percentage increase. We think that the differences are certainly small, we certainly concede that, but nevertheless we don't think they're insignificant because they're small. We do think that the Commission does have to pay attention to the need to maintain those relativities, those margins for skill, if you like. Not least because, as has been mentioned, that question of where's the incentive for people to sort of work harder, improve their skills, move up the ladder, maintaining those award relativities through a percentage-based increase is a crucial point for that. I will conclude with just making a brief mention about the equal remuneration principle. Certainly we want to acknowledge the role of the other parties and the role of the Commission in facilitating the formulation of the equal remuneration principle. We certainly have noted that the WA government is has included a point about a legislative remuneration principle as part of its response to the final report of the Ministerial Review of the State Industrial Relations System. And yes, with that in mind, anything we can do to certainly facilitate the process, assist the Commission to sort of further the formulation of this and adoption of this principle. Certainly very pleased to take part in that. And as I say, acknowledge the role of the Commission itself in bringing us to this point. But that concludes our submissions on all of those matters. And happy to take any further questions should they be required.
Dr. Diamond, is there anything you want to add in the next few days? Mr. Entrecken's accepted my invitation to put further submission to us regarding the equal remuneration principle and how it might operate by reference to the experience in Queensland. Do you want an opportunity to do that too?
Well, perhaps, Commissioner, what we could do is provide you with some information, maybe not specifically about Queensland, but generally about the role we see of a male comparator,
That would be
if you
helpful.
like,
Yes.
or not having a male comparator, and that could be reference to state level, and that can also be Fair Work Commission level as well.
Thank you. That would be helpful.
I'll see what I can do. Thank you.
Thank you. Right. Mr. Farrell, in that case, you might like to do the same if you want to give some thought to the issue of the equal remuneration principle and the issues I raised with Mr. Intrican.
Certainly, Chief. I'll get some
Or any
instructions
other
from
issues,
them.
because whilst the parties have done work in preparing the principle itself, we need to consider whether it's appropriate to be included in the principles in the terms that have been agreed.
Of course. Yes, I'll get some instructions on that one.
Thank you. Now, Mr. Toomey.
Thank you, Chief Commissioner. If it pleases the Commission in court session, I'll draw the Commission's attention to a few key points in the submission, and I'll also make a comment on some of the issues that have been discussed this morning. I'll start by saying Kaya Nala Kadich Nunga Wajak Mort Kan Karak Nijabucha, which is just an acknowledgement in the local language of the Wajak people of the Noongar Nation as the owners of the land on which we meet. My first comments, I guess I'll go to what WACOS is doing here in terms of relevance and expertise. As you realise, we're the peak body of the community services sector, and so our members are not-for-profit community-based services providing frontline services to communities across WA, but particularly some of the most vulnerable and disadvantaged citizens. So that goes through the range of disability, aged care, family and children's services, mental health, alcohol and drug, financial counselling, emergency relief, community legal centres and so on. And I suppose the important thing there is that our relationship with frontline services, providing support to low-income households, many of which are reliant on minimum wages, means that we're well placed to contribute to the discussion around community standards and the adequacy of wages. The second thing that I'd say is the community services sector has predominantly female workforce, and we're also then reliant particularly on public and charitable funding. The other thing that I'd say is that we've focused, well, WACOS has been around for 60 years, but certainly in the last decade or so, we've focused on improving our expertise in issues around poverty and the cost of living. So WACOS led developing the first cost of living research in Australia since 2007, which has been adopted by a lot of the other states. And we've increasingly been partnering with the universities in Western Australia around improving the quality of that research. So I'm also currently a senior industry fellow with Bankwest Curtin Economics Centre, but I'm not in any way speaking on behalf of the university there. We also partner with the University of WA around the 100 Families Research project we do, looking at the lived experience of the most vulnerable households in WA. So as you will see from our submission, we've recommended a 6% increase to the state minimum wage of around $33.61 per week. We have not made any recommendations about relatively for higher award wages. We've just focused on the minimum wage because we see that's the area that is of most relevance to us and our member services. And we strongly believe a decent increase in the state minimum wage is needed to meet the needs of the low paid and to contribute to improved living standards. And so in our submission this year, we've collected and made reference to some new and contemporary research around poverty, inequality, cost of living and living standards. And I suppose, so the evidence that we're presenting highlights that living standards for individuals and households on minimum wage level incomes have generally fallen relative to living standards prevalent across our community, and also relative to rises in essential living costs, most particularly housing, essential services like utilities and food, and also in relation to the proportion that minimum wage income households can now afford to spend on health, recreation and educational expenses, all of which are things that we know contribute to quality of life, as well as ongoing health and productivity. And so I'd say being able to point to these changes in spending patterns is we believe the clearest indication of declining living standards for minimum wage level income households. So in our submission around the cost of living, main thing we refer to is our latest 2018 cost of living report, which we discuss on page 5. I note there's also some interesting research that we footnote there from the Social Policy Research Centre at UNSW, which is new minimum income for healthy living budget standards research that you may find very useful in terms of looking at what are you talking about living standards and how does that relate to people's capacity and to spend on particular items. When it comes to the cost of living, the biggest single finding remains around the cost of housing. And so you will see that the patterns in Western Australia have shown that median rental and median house prices have dropped in the last few years, but you'll also show that some of the research that we point to, including the Anglicare rental affordability snapshot, but also more particularly, there's also a recent Ahuri report that we point to there on the lack of affordable rental for minimum wage households. And it basically shows, although we've seen this increase in supply and the drop of median rentals, that hasn't been trickling down to minimum wage income level households. The other new evidence that we point to there is the recent work around food insecurity and food stress. And so on page 11, we refer to some recent research by Dr. Christina Pollard and her team at Department of Health at Curtin University. And that, I'd say, is some of the leading research in Australia around food insecurity and food stress. And so you'll see we've also got those lovely colour maps on, I think they're pages 13 and 14 of the food stress index that they've developed there. And I guess that gives you a picture of a combination of food affordability and people's income levels and access depending on where they're located within the community. So it helps us when we're looking at food stress, kind of food relief services and so on to target where is the need most prevalent in the community. The other thing is that we then also have been coordinating a program through the Community Relief and Resilience Forum, where we've been working with food relief organisations like Food Bank and others to actually develop a more integrated and strategic approach to food recovery and food relief. And this has been done specifically to meet both growing demand for food relief within the community in Western Australia and also the challenges that we're seeing around the need to improve nutrition for low-income households because of the evidence showing that budgetary pressures have been leading to poor nutrition and that's having impacts on children growing up in poverty. We also provide some comments on page 15 around utility hardship, debt and disconnection rates. And we've highlighted there in particular the trend we've seen over the last couple of years with a dramatic rise in disconnection rates in Western Australia. And so we went over the last 2 years from having one of the lowest disconnection rates for electricity to the highest in Australia, and a similar trend also when it comes to gas. I do note in the most recent state budget that there's been a deliberate decision to cap household fees and charges when it comes to electricity and water and gas and a lot of other things as well. And that's certainly been a recognition of the impact that those dramatic rises have had on debt levels, on the level of people who are on payment programs and on those disconnection levels. I suppose...
What was capped, Mr Toomey? I thought that utilities and charges went up.
They went up, but they went up very small levels. They went up more or less at CPI. So I have the exact numbers here. But basically what they've said, while there isn't a specific formula that they've given a clear intention that for the foreseeable future they're going to try and keep household fees and charges increases to around CPI.
Okay, thank you.
And I think that also represents potentially a shift in policy from where they were previously going, particularly when it came to electricity, where they were looking at moving to full retail market contestability and privatisation of the networks. So there hasn't been any full declaration around that, but you would read the sign being that they've stepped back from doing that. I suppose what I'd say in response to that is that decision by the WA government to limit increases to household fees and charges is a clear admission of the impacts of recent increases. And while it decreases, further pressures on those households, it actually does nothing for those households that we know have got into financial hardship and debt over recent years. So we haven't seen a winding back of that in terms of concessions. And so it may be preventing future increases in hardship, but it does little to help those already experiencing hardship. And at the same time, while it's a clear indicator that is a growing concern. One of the other things that we highlight as new research here is some recent work from Bankwest Curtin Economic Centre around digital access, and where they develop a digital stress metric. And I suppose this has been important for us because both it reflects changing patterns in household expenditure that we've seen, but more importantly, it reflects how much digital access has become an essential service for many people. And this is particularly a concern for us when we see that when it comes to Western Australia, we do have, with low-income households and regional households, quite a percentage that don't have access to digital services. But increasingly, we're seeing state and federal governments moving their transactional services online. So if you're a job seeker, it's critical to be able to have access to those services. And similarly, we hear from community resource centres out in the regions, and also from local government libraries, that they're now spending the majority of their time assisting people to use public internet in those spaces just around two things, and their Centrelink and Medicare access. And so that has seen what in the past we might have considered those communication infrastructure, digital access, to be more of a luxury. It's now become an essential part of access when it actually comes to finding jobs and accessing services. So I guess that's why we've included that new research there as well.
Okay, how do I interpret what you produced there by way of a table and a chart? Tell me how I interpret it, please.
This is
On page
what's
18,
there
on
on
page
page 18.
18.
It shows. So the chart, the kind of box and whisker boxes there is just showing the dramatic spread of expenditure for each of the income quintiles, and the other bit above is kind of showing how many and which quintiles actually fall into which of those particular percentiles. So I don't actually know that graph is hugely helpful. It does give you a good sense of that there is a dramatic spread of expenditure, and it also does highlight that those in the lowest income quintiles are spending less, but they're still spending a significant amount of money. And so one of the things that it highlights, particularly when we know that those lower quintiles are experiencing financial stress, that they're still feeling that this is an essential service that they need to spend money on. And certainly when we look at some of the trends from the ABS HILDA data or the household expenditure survey data, they show that increase over time in the expenditure on communications. That also then tends to reflect how more integral that's become to day-to-day life, but particularly around access to services and access to jobs. There's some information that we also provide there around regional costs. I suppose there's kind of two things I'd highlight there. One is that when it comes to regional housing, you can see quite dramatically there's a lot of market volatility there. The other thing that then becomes a complicating factor is for minimum wage households in the regions, whether there's in fact appropriate and affordable accommodation that fits within their budget within the regions. And that's certainly been an issue. The other thing that dramatically jumps out is when it comes to the cost of food and also the cost of electricity and water. And particularly around electricity and water, when we look at communities in the Pilbara and the Kimberley, consumption rates can be double, and people can be paying 2 to 3 times as much as the average household to meet their consumption within those areas, and that's driven largely by the climate there. Even though we have a consistent policy across the state to match the pricing when it comes to electricity and water, the actual consumption needs in those regions are much higher. And the problem, particularly when it comes to water, is that then we've got inclining block tariffs. And so when you're spending over a certain level, your water costs go up quite dramatically. And so one of the things that we've found is that larger families in the regions, particularly if they're living in poor quality accommodation, have dramatically higher costs when it comes to electricity and water and are much more at risk of utility hardship. The other thing that I'll draw your attention to is the research around financial stress and hardship. We do make some mention there of the work the Fair Work Commission did in 2017 that shows 27.9% of low-paid employee households had experienced financial stress. The data that we then provide there in some more detail, which reflects some of the evidence we gave you last year, is particularly around the work that's done by the WA Financial Counselling Network in metro and some regional centres. And it kind of highlights the difference in the expenditure patterns for those households who are in financial hardship and have sought assistance. And one of the things that you can see from that data is that their housing costs in particular are dramatically higher than the average. One of the things that we've done in our analysis there is that we've pulled out the data for wage-only households and we've pulled out the data for low-income wage-only households. So and when you look at the wage-only households, you see that their housing costs are on average 48% of their weekly expenditure, which is dramatically higher than I think the national average through the HES is on a further page here, but it's round about half of that is 26%. So, and there's a bit of a chicken and egg question there of the extent to which that is people who have got into financial hardship because of their housing costs, or people whose financial circumstances have changed and they're struggling to keep hold of the family house. And there's potentially a bit of both there. So yes, so it does highlight that housing expenses there are particularly high.
Sorry, Mr. Toomey, the
yeah.
difference between WA wage-only households on 25
And low-income wage-only
households at 26.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Let me explain that. The low-income wage-only households. So what we've done here is we didn't have the information to allow us to say are they on a minimum wage or an award wage. Basically, what we did is we used the Henderson 50% poverty line as a cut-off, given the household circumstances, to identify, really to separate out who are the low-income households there that are relying on wage-only income from the general pattern overall of all households on wages-only income. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does, but the low-income wage-only households are wage earners.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, so they are wage earners. What we've done there, I suppose, is we wanted to separate out, there are some high-income households who are also very much in financial hardship who will go to financial counselling services. And often, there's a suspicion there that often, that has been driven by either changes of circumstances or actually people who have overextended themselves on their mortgage commitments, which certainly reflects a lot of the findings of the Banking Royal Commission about the formula they were using to calculate what were affordable mortgage repayments for people based on very old data or based on household costs that were equivalent with the poverty line. So there we focused very much on, could we identify the closest proxy group for minimum wage households and see what their expenditure patterns were like. And the clear thing you see is they're spending over half of their income on housing costs alone. The other thing I would say that it highlights is that they then have high expenditure on food and transport and utilities, and you can see that they have dramatically low expenditure when it comes to health, education, recreation and clothing. So it shows quite dramatically that those other factors which we would consider things that go to a reasonable and decent lifestyle standard of living, that they're dramatically having to cut back on that. So, you know, by comparison, they're spending 50% on housing rather than 26%. They're spending a little bit more on food, so it's 19.8% versus 18% is the average household, and 6.4% on utilities rather than 4% for the average. But their recreation is 0.6% rather than the Australian average, which is 11%, and health is 2.7% rather than the 6%. And usually we'd consider health to be an essential service that you wouldn't want to be, you know, it's not discretionary, you wouldn't be cutting that unless you're absolutely forced to. And that also comes through very strongly on the work that we did looking at single parent households, that they were cutting back on their health and recreation expenditure. And our concern is that when households are doing that, we know it's going to have long-term impacts on their health and well-being that's actually going to cost us more as a community in terms of what happens with rates of chronic disease and obesity, but it's also then going to impact on their productivity throughout their life as well.
And this is on financial counselling. This is people who go
Yes.
to organisations.
Yeah. So this is
keep records, you have
404.
access to.
Yeah.
So what sort of sample size are we talking about?
So
I'm interested in the quality of evidence that people put forward.
So we're talking about, this was 404 household budgets that were done as a snapshot in the month of September last year, 2018. So this is basically all of the households that have gone to, or the vast majority of households that have gone to financial counselling services in metropolitan Perth and a number of regional centres, particularly in the southwest and the midwest. We've got less good data for the northwest.
Okay, thank you.
I suppose the other thing that I'd say there is also then going to page 28, which is gaps in expenditure shares. There's a table there for households with financial stress measures. So that's taken from the ABS household expenditure survey data, and it also shows that similar trend that those households in financial stress are paying more for their housing, and they've cut back on their discretionary spending on health, transport and food as a consequence. And similarly, when you look at the chart below that as well, that highlights, these are a number of deprivation measures, and deprivation measures are based on surveys that are done looking at community standards of what counts as a basic or decent living standard, what things would you expect an average household to be able to do. And so these points: unable to raise cash, can't pay household bills, could not eat or heat, sought assistance and so on. So it shows that similar trend of those deprivation measures increasing. So I note there's a section after that where we talk a bit about issues to do with income equality. And I would note as well that actually when it comes to it, often wealth inequality is a bigger issue for us than income equality is. But it's also something where we have less data. I guess the other thing that I comment on, we've given a chart there showing kind of the relativity between the, a WOTI average weekly earnings in WA versus the state minimum wage, which does show you that kind of increasing gap. I noted before there was the discussion around the UK Low Pay Commission and the 60% target, and I thought I'd offer some comments on that. So at the moment, I believe our state minimum wage is around 40% of average weekly earnings. So it gives you an idea if you were setting that the gap would actually be quite large. One of the things to say about the 60% target is that it's probably related to, but not the same as the OECD poverty measures, where they set 60% of average household earnings as their poverty line, whereas we tend to use 50%. However, often when we're doing that, we're talking about household expenditure and household income rather than individual expenditure and individual income, and which tends to make more sense when you're talking about poverty, because when it comes to spending on essential services, food, housing and so on, that's something you do as a household, not as an individual. But reflecting back on that, when it comes to talking about wages, you need to be thinking about how is the wage earner contributing to the income of that household as a whole. So I guess the comment that I would make there about setting a 60% target is that I'd say it's a useful metric or benchmark to set, but I wouldn't say that you're using it as an absolute formula. I think there is still a role for actually giving consideration to a whole pile of factors where you're sitting it, and certainly not having something that's individually bouncing up and down relative to how wages are going. But I suppose that has been seen as kind of that particular marker or metric in the OECD that's also then been seen as a useful distinction in those economies between those ones that have higher versus lower rates of inequality and how it translates to how their community functions. I suppose the other comment that I'd offer there is that actually from WACOS's point of view, our concern is really about the relativity between average and minimum wages, but also then about the income support and the social security safety net. And I guess one of our concerns is, and this comes to the ongoing discussion around wage stagnation and also the other issues around productivity, is that our New Start allowance in particular and the series of benefits have been kept artificially low for 25 years. We've had very strong calls from across the economy for those to be increased. So certainly we see that increasing the state minimum wage and the federal minimum wage plays a really important role in helping to mitigate against the impacts of poverty and inequality in our community. But if anything, you would say that the absence of a decent safety net behind that has actually made things harder. And we would argue that's been one of the factors, along with loss of bargaining power, that's also been contributing to that wage stagnation. One of the things that I did want to pick up was in the discussion around productivity and whether or not businesses can afford increases in wages. During the break earlier, I will pass you on, I'll kind of on notice some more details. I've just pulled up from a recent presentation that I did a slide. Again, this is national data. It was from a 2018 report from the University of Adelaide on the wages crisis, but it was just highlighting the gap between real productivity versus real wages. So CCI was putting forward the claim that we needed increases in productivity to be able to afford an increase in the minimum wage. But actually the trend and the pattern we've seen over the last 2 decades has been that we've had productivity increases much ahead of what we've seen happening with wages. So if anything, the concern would be, and certainly the concerns that we heard being reflected by the RBA governor and others, is that if we're not seeing an increase in real wages, that at some point is going to start to undermine productivity and start to undermine the health of our economy. So certainly that's my concern, and I'm happy to provide that
If
and
you
some
do
other
so, that
material.
would be very helpful. Thank you.
So there's also, I'd say, the other material that I'll share with you as well highlights that at the same time that we've seen that, we have seen returns, increases in profitability and dividends across particular areas in the community that haven't matched the lifts in wages.
I suppose the issue there, Mr. Twomey, is the impact on small firms and
Yes,
small businesses, which we have a vacuum, unfortunately.
yeah, we don't have the
Of
information.
material to determine, we have proxies for various measures, but they're not entirely accurate. They can only give us a sense of where things might be, and that's the difficulty, speaking for myself, that we have to grapple with.
Yes.
Given
yeah.
the nature of our jurisdiction, which is different, of course, as you well know, to the federal jurisdiction and its limit of coverage.
Yeah, and we face a similar issue with that with our sector. So we've done research with our sector and our members around state versus federal coverage, and we're roughly 70% in the federal system, 30%. Although actually when we did the survey, we had 20% who were certain they were in the state system, 60% who were certain they were in the federal system, and 20% in the middle who seemed very confused and often told us things that didn't match the information we had
It's
about.
a common retort that we get.
Yes. So it's certainly a similar issue for us. I suppose, so in the research we've referred to there, we have pointed to some OECD research around higher minimum wages being associated with the compression in income distribution and reduced inequality. There is also that interesting World Bank research in Indonesia around the gender pay gap, where they found that increasing minimum wages there reduced the gender pay gap, but they didn't find any evidence at all of any change in relative employment prospects. So that was quite a positive outcome. That's particularly important for us for a couple of reasons. One is that WA has the highest gender wage gap in Australia. We're 23% compared to the national average of 14%. We also include reference to some 2017 Melbourne Institute research that found women are more likely to be employed on the minimum wage, so 18.5% versus 12.4%, and so hence a rise in the minimum wage is also going to have a positive impact on the gender wage gap. And this is also particularly an issue that's a concern to us, as our sector is dominated by women. Okay, I think I'll just jump to a couple of other comments as well. I mentioned the stuff on productivity earlier. There was also some discussion that seemed a little bit confused around the graphs that we had on poverty and youth unemployment. So that discussion was referring, I think, to, there were three tables that we had. I will just find them for you. I think they're on page 39. So this is basically about the employment prospects, the non-participation rates and poverty rates of young people after they leave home. So this tracks them from 19 to 26 years of age, and this is using the ABS Hilda data and controlling for their circumstances. So what it actually shows is that young people who've grown up in poverty, even after leaving home and their circumstances having changed in that way, have much higher ongoing rates of poverty that persist for an additional 8 years, even after they're no longer in those circumstances, that their employment outcomes and their non-participation rates are much higher. But I was a little unsure about what was the discussion or the conclusions that were being drawn based on that. I'm happy to provide kind of more discussion around what that research shows, but I wasn't quite sure I followed the argument about what the implications of that were. I guess the concern for us is that it does show a very clear trend that if you are growing up in poverty, that tends to have lifelong impacts. It's unclear what the mechanisms or the causality there is, and it could be a combination of things. One is it could be around your motivation, your access to opportunities. It could also be linked to ongoing obligations you might have to family and siblings who you might be supporting. The causality there isn't clear, but it does show that children growing up in poverty has an impact on their employment outcomes as adults. And so certainly whatever we can do to reduce family poverty, we hope has a long-term impact on participation and productivity in the economy.
Mr. Toomey, I'm not sure if you were referring to the question I asked Mr. Farrell, which actually wasn't related to youth in particular, but just generally people in low-paid employment.
Yeah.
But I understood Mr. Farrell's response to be that 76% of low-paid people move into higher-paying jobs within a year. And he was citing Department of Jobs and Small Business Analysis, HILDA results from 2017. Is that consistent with WACOS's experience, or would you tell us that those figures look different?
I would have to take that on notice. It's not consistent with our experience, but certainly my colleagues are very familiar with the HILDA data, so I can ask them to look into that. I'm happy to come back to you on that. But
Mr. Farrell, did I understand your response correctly?
Yes, Commissioner Manuel, you did, yes.
Thank you.
okay, yes. Look, I'll look into that. That isn't consistent with sort of general experience from services. Yeah.
Thank you.
But yeah, I will take that on notice. Okay, so the other thing I wanted to comment on briefly was the discussion about the equal remuneration principle. So as we mentioned in our submission, we strongly support the draft equal remuneration principle. We're a sector with a strongly female workforce where there has been a history of underpayment. It's been an issue that was sought to address at a national level. There was a 2012 equal remuneration order made by the Fair Work Commission. We had a matching award decision that was made here that wasn't specific to addressing gender equality, but effectively having the same impact by matching things there. I guess what I would say there is we're very supportive of the principle. Our concern becomes what's the mechanism for actually ensuring that it happens in practice? Because the problem is the experience we've had is our services have been caught in the gap between their obligations to deliver public services and the level of public funding not matching those increases. And so that's been creating a situation where services are becoming unsustainable. We've had a very recent decision by the state government to address that, but that's only been limited to 24/7 homeless services. So it clearly recognises that problem, but it's implying that the other services can deal with the problem by reducing levels of service. And our concern is that that's happening at a time when we know that there's unmet need and growing need in the community. We've seen particular impacts on that for after-hours services, outreach services and regional services that are particularly struggling. But most of our organisations have reached a point in the last 18 months or are coming to that point now where their funding is simply no longer sustainable. And the problem that we're seeing as a consequence of that is a reduction in service quality. We're also seeing then staff are leaving services. They're being replaced by less skilled staff on lower wages, basically. So it's actually not having the impact that we would like it to have. And certainly it's actually kind of undermining the level of skilled employment within our sector. So we're very strongly supportive of it, but we're very concerned to make sure what's the mechanism to make sure that when it comes to providing essential public and community services that they're actually supported there.
recognising that that's a real world problem for you,
Yeah.
I'm not sure if there's anything that the Commission, in its consideration of this matter, can do, because having made a determination, then the question is how the organisations fund
Yeah.
those determinations. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. So, and certainly I know you mentioned earlier, Chief Commissioner, the Community Legal Centres Association.
Yes.
That was their particular concern as well.
Yes.
And we've spoken to them and many other services about the same issues. I guess our point is this very much comes down to our advocacy to the WA government around supporting what they're doing in principle and them wanting to address either legislatively or through the Commission doing this. We would just like to see them to match that commitment in what they're doing in the funding of public services. So just to conclude, I guess as a concluding comment, I would say that every dollar a low wage worker earns is more likely to be spent directly in the local economy, boosting demand for essential goods and services. We've been facing a slowing domestic economy. And there are the issues that we've talked about earlier around wage stagnation and also rising essential living costs. And also we've seen a longer term trend of that growing gap between minimum and average wages in WA, but recent positive decisions by the Commission have helped to improve the minimum wage bite there. I guess our concern is looking at the projections around domestic consumption and also the projections around wage growth. We're not clear to see where that's going to be coming from if we're not actually seeing an increase in wages that's an increase in the minimum wage to help drive that. We're particularly concerned that when you look to the out years, you know, the growth in the WA economy is increasingly looking to rely on domestic consumption, and with kind of stagnant wages and the kind of the lack of consumer confidence and sentiment around there, and the increase saving we've seen among those that can save, we're very concerned that actually something needs to be done that is going to assist minimum wage households to actually be able to keep up with the cost of living and to contribute more widely to the economy. Thank you.
Mr Toomey, when do you think you'd be in a position to provide that further view? Can we say by about Monday, close of
Yes.
business Monday?
Yes, I should be able to do that.
Is there anything further anyone wishes to add? I don't wish to invite each of you to give a reply, given that you've each had an opportunity to read the others' initial submissions and today reply, but is there anything in particular that arises?
If I may, Chief Commissioner, and I promise not to be more than a minute in closing. In essence, the CCIW have been criticised in terms of the rate of productivity not matched, or sorry, the rate of minimum wage increases has not matched the increases in productivity. And I think we have been taken out of context. What we were referring to in making the suggestion is that the RBA governor's quote of matching 3% needs to be taken in full context, and the full quote needed to be understood. So that's the further matter. The second aspect is a basis of the Unions WA submissions that an increase in minimum wage would therefore reflect an increase in consumer spending. The evidence that we've seen today does not support that. We have WACOS who are saying there's higher levels of debt and financial from household cost increases and food. I can't remember the exact term, but food stress, I beg your pardon. So we say that a natural reflection of that is any increase is unlikely to increase discretionary spending. It is likely to match those increases in non-discretionary spending, particularly in household expenditure as well. So the end result of that,
I understand the argument is also that for every increase, every dollar increase, that a significant proportion of that will be spent, not saved.
yes, it will be spent in some point. We say not necessarily in discretionary spending.
But that's all Mr Toomey was saying. What the Chief Commissioner has put to you is what Mr Toomey was saying.
Yes,
It'll get spent. He didn't distinguish between discretionary and non-discretionary.
It's consumption.
it's consumption. There's no doubt about it. But Mr. Christmas's particular evidence was the need to increase discretionary spending, and in particular in the services that we say the majority of the employees that will be affected by today's minimum wage order. And we, on numerous occasions, and all parties refer to retail and food accommodation services, are areas in where discretionary spending needs to be increased. So it is in our submission no evidence, in fact the opposite, there is evidence that that won't occur. And that is a matter in which we say the Commission should take into consideration. That concludes the final comments that I wish to make, unless there was any other questions.
Thank you, Mr Farrell.
Thank you.
Now,
Mr Toomey, you look like you were about to say something.
Yes, I was just going to highlight that what we were saying around essential living costs is that if you increase the incomes of low-income households, they will immediately go and spend it on essential goods and services. So there are certainly things that they will be spending in the local economy, but it's going to go on housing, utilities, food, transport, health, education. They are the places that it will certainly get spent first.
thank you, Mr Toomey. All right, thank you all. Now, a number of...
Dr Diamond.
Yes, Dr Diamond.
I will be very quick and say that if indeed the limits are that the amount of the extra dollars spent, the extra dollar of increase will be spent on non-discretionary items, that underscores our point that a substantial increase is needed in order to ensure that it edges into the discretionary items as well.
Thank you. Thank you all. Now, a number of you are going to provide us with further comment on a range of issues. If you would kindly do that by the close of business Monday, that would be very helpful. Thank you. As you know, we will be reconvening as soon as we can after the Fair Work Commission decision on its annual wage review, and we'll hear from you at that time. Thank you. We'll adjourn.